Thank you so much, Andrew. Good morning. Good to meet you. Good to be in this wonderful place. I'm from Shropshire, and I've been a pastor for 20 years. And I'm just about to hand over the leadership of my church to one of my colleagues very shortly. When I started, we had a strong culture of many positive things in the Christian church, but not a very clear understanding of our community. And 20 years ago or so, even more than 20 years, I decided to try and find out something about our community. And I noticed that the credit card deregulation and project was well underway in our society, unleashed in the 1980s, if you can remember that far back. And I noticed the available credit was simply astonishing. In fact, I went up and down the high street one morning and I said to each major retailer, how much credit would you give me on your store card? And I just totted it all up without any conditions. I could have had thousands and thousands of pounds worth of credit. And I had a kind of prophetic moment shortly after that. I thought, this nation is heading for a personal indebtedness crisis. That was over 20 years ago. And I felt stirred in my heart to think, what do we do about it in the church? And I said to my secretary, try and find out what other churches are doing to help people who are seriously in debt. And she scoured the country and we looked at various things. And eventually she said, I want you to go to Derby and meet the city missioner. He's running something which is quite novel, I believe. It's called a food bank. I said, what's a food bank? And so, with a colleague, I went over to Derby and went to one of the back streets into a tumble-down little house, and upstairs I saw more baked beans than I'd ever seen in my life, in one upstairs room. And this guy, Jeff, said to me, we give them £10 of goods, and they promise to pay £10 to one of their creditors. And I came away having had what we now call a light bulb moment. And I said to my church, we're going to start a food bank. And they said, what? And we did. And look where we are today. It's mainstream culture in Britain that food banks are needed and that food banks are fundamentally resourced by the Christian church. The Trussell Trust tell me they have 400 food banks and 1,000 outlets. You know the stats and the numbers that are growing, and it's all part of your story here in Durham. That was the beginning of a journey for me as a church leader to try and integrate a vibrant church community with a relevant compassion for the social needs of our locality in Shropshire. Fast forward. 2010, I'm still a pastor and I've done many things. We've been involved in the prison, we've been with ex-offenders, we've done a bit of alcohol rehabilitation, we're working with the elderly, we've tried all sorts of things in our church. 2010, a prominent national leader in the movement, known at that point as New Frontiers, invited me to a meal. He said, I need to talk to you about something, but he didn't tell me what it was. Great thing is never accept such invitations. Anyway, I went to this meal and he said, we would like you to help all our churches develop their capacity in social action. That was the moment that Jubilee Plus was born. We formed an organization, a network, to help churches around the country increase their capacity to serve their communities, primarily through social action, which is a great focus of today, but also into social enterprise, and also into the public policy implications of what we are doing on the ground. I'm sure you'll agree we have to integrate these things together. Because as soon as you come up with the key needs, you come up with what we can only describe as political issues, public policy issues. How are resources being distributed? What input can the church have to advise or guide or challenge the authorities locally or nationally? And we realize that social action, social enterprise and social justice go together as part of the outworking of the kingdom in the modern 21st century context of the church. And that's our commission And we travel around the country training, resourcing, networking, and working with all sorts of different people to assist them on that journey. And one of the things we quickly realized is that a great weapon for us as churches, or a great resource, would be really specific research into the outputs and particularly the outcomes of the social action that we're doing on the ground. Last year I went to meet the head of the well-known think tank, the Centre for Social Justice, which is a highly significant and influential body in terms of current policy and current debate. And I said to him, and they're researching all sorts of different things, and I said to him, are you doing anything to measure what the churches are doing in terms of formal research? And he said, no, we're not. And I said, well, who is? And the answer was really only the franchise organizations within their particular areas, like the Trussell Trust and others do their own research. But no one is really addressing this issue. And it seemed to me that there's a story to be told, an emerging story of the influence that the church is having on changing the outcomes of people's lives, not just putting the sticking plaster on, but reforming and transforming lives. Would you agree with me? That's probably your story, your ticket, your vision, your passion. And so we in Jubilee Plus, and Andrew here heads up our team currently, have been working on trying to identify research projects that we can develop in order to specifically influence public policy in the long term and advocate the role of the church in particular, and also encourage the church on its mission. We've got some resources in terms of research available, which Andy Biggs is looking after in the foyer. You can have a look at in the lunch break. So Jubilee Plus is very much involved in that. And another little incident that happened last year was very influential in my mind. We did a little research paper based on an internet survey about whether social action helps with church growth. Now, there's an interesting point. And we found some very interesting evidence emerging that, in fact, for those churches that engaged responsibly with social action in a way that was meaningful, relevant, well organized, that they often saw growth in their churches. So we put together a little research paper, and just for fun, we sent a paper copy to every parliamentarian. And then a few weeks later, we received a phone call from a senior civil servant in DCLG. Said, we picked up your paper and we'd like to invite you to a meeting with one of our ministers, Baroness Varsi. Maybe you know Baroness Varsi, who has two roles, but one of them was for a minister responsible for faith communities. So I ended up in the House of Lords on the basis of a rather quick survey that we did and a paper copy that we passed to every parliamentarian, doing a public meeting with Baroness Varsi and the press and other Christian organizations just over a year ago. And it just struck me, research opens doors. And we've got to pursue this a little bit further. We sat down and we had a conversation and we made some statements, and she used this particular platform to make a speech in which she made the rather grand statement, "Those who do God do good." Now, it's hard to imagine politicians 10 or 15 years ago saying such a thing, and not everyone in her party or government would agree with that, but that's what she said. So Jubilee Plus is on a journey, along with people like you, which we feel is incredibly significant. We have seen and are seeing a phenomenal cultural change within our society and within the churches. That's been going on probably for a generation, but is accelerating now in terms of its social commitment and its caring capacity. The context is a painful one. Vast cutbacks in public services, challenging and painful benefit reforms, and a drastic reduction in financial support for the third sector. Everyone is now recognizing the limited capacity of the state in the context of the current financial restrictions. And, as our next speaker may comment on, there is a search for partners from local authorities and others that is probably unprecedented in its sense of urgency and intentionality. But there's another thing I want to comment on. As we went through and have been going through this protracted and complex financial and economic crisis, and even as we're now speaking of economic growth coming back, we still face a tremendous social danger, and that is that the poor become poorer. Even as the majority of the nation pulls through. That is the critical insight and observation of our social situation that drives me. We can see plenty of examples, even in this last year, of businesses that have pulled through, jobs that have been created, and I rejoice as much as anyone else with that good news. But in many ways, the resources given to the poorest in our society are less now than they've been for many, many years. And there has come into our culture, and that's something which the church needs to feel deeply about and to address. But there's also come into our culture something which is developing, which we in Jubilee Plus are, I make no bones about this, we're challenging this assumption. And this is something we're concerned about. It's not a formal position of any politician, but it's a modern myth that's developing, that we can divide the poor into the deserving and the undeserving. It's in our media, it's in our public consciousness, it's in the national psyche that we want to help some people but not necessarily help others because they haven't necessarily stewarded well the help we've given up to that point. But as Christians, there can never be a fundamental divide in our perception of people between deserving and undeserving. It is contraindicated by biblical Christianity and the example of Jesus at the most fundamental level of the gospel. It's not that we don't need wisdom, much wisdom in handling the complex responses people make to social care from the state, the third sector, or the church or charities. It is a complex process. I've experienced that many times. I remember helping a guy who'd come off drugs, and he used to come and visit me in my office. And I didn't realize at the time he was casing the joint, and one night he broke into the centre and broke into my filing cabinet, and it still bears the marks of his crowbar to this day. But he wasn't undeserving, fundamentally, of the grace of God, because he did that to me. And such was my thought as I faced visiting him in prison and having a little discussion about what had happened in my office a few weeks earlier. And so here we have a really big challenge, folks. And this is the prophetic burden of Jubilee Plus. Not that we become just great practitioners, which is very important. Not that we just increase our capacity, which is very important. Not that we have a good biblical foundation for what we do, which is absolutely vital. Not that we have trained church leaders who know how to handle the implications of social action, which I spend a lot of time working on. But that we don't fall into the trap that our society could lead us into of making fundamental and irreversible moral judgments about the people who are in need of God's mercy and the practical care of people like you and me. You can question me about this in the lunch break, but that is something that I feel is very, very important contextually. What we've noticed around the country is an amazing awakening and development of the muscles of the church to care for the poor. We have noticed an incredible rise of the Christian franchised organizations Trussell Trust and Food Bank is one example. Street pastors, I believe, are represented here, who are now over 250 projects in the UK, and they started from zero in 2003. I mean, the story could go on in many different ways. It's amazing what's happening. New ideas coming thick and fast. We've got Safer Families for Children here, another fascinating and innovative idea developed in the last few years by churches. The social capital of churches addressed to the social needs of our nation is one of the most dynamic realities that is going to help this nation during the next few years. And you and I are right in the centre of that process. And I just want to paint today a little bit of the big picture to encourage you in your specific world. Our research of churches suggests that their social action capacity has been consistently increasing year after year during the recent years. One of the things we're doing as Jubilee Plus, and we'd love your support in this, is we want to be part of the public advocacy of what the churches are doing at the highest levels in government. We don't represent any particular project or franchise. We don't represent any particular church denomination. We're a separate organisation working across all denominations. We started within one network, but we've expanded far beyond it. But we feel there is a particular role to advocate what is generically happening through research and relationships and public and consultations with government, which we would like to be part of fulfilling. That is one of the mandates upon our team, which we are seeking to take forward during the next few years. I want to encourage you with this thought. Faith-led initiatives in this country have brought much positive social change in the last 20 or 30 years. We may feel some battles have been lost, but I just want to give you a few examples of big changes that have taken place because the Christians really got their act together and saw an opportunity and saw a need. Let's start with something that has a real local resonance, the fair trade movement. From a tiny little idea, laughed at commercially and even in churches, comes a culture-changing movement. The Jubilee Debt Campaign, the Make Poverty History campaign, the London Citizens Movement, the current modern slavery bill legislation have all been fundamentally influenced by Christians and church groups more than anyone else. The Food Bank movement, which is now centre stage in our political discourse, admittedly with considerable controversy, and I won't go into that publicly now. But it's addressing an issue and it's raising questions. And I believe that there's a lot more to come from the Christian church in the next generation, especially as young people in their teens and 20s and 30s develop a social passion and a kingdom passion alongside their firm commitment to local churches and to the orthodox Christian faith and gospel as expressed in the scriptures. So we at Jubilee Plus travel the country, we resource people, we network, we advise, we train, we link up with the franchise organisations, we try and work out what's going on nationally, we try and provide good information, and we are particularly interested at the moment, and this is the final thing I really need to say today, in the fact that what has happened in the nation and what is happening now is that the social development of outreach of individual churches is now moving into another dimension in many areas. It's moving from one church doing its own thing to churches in an area sharing, which is very evident in Durham and this area. And then it's moving into a third dimension which is the development of regional networks of church-based projects, Christian charity-based projects that are becoming connected in addressing these fundamental social issues. We're seeing the development of informal, mostly informal networks of activists that I believe are strategically significant, and I see and I think it's probably developing quite healthily here in Durham. And we travel the country to different areas and see the same thing beginning to happen. And I think that's very significant. And I want to encourage you that the networking process is incredibly important to strengthen the muscles of what we are doing. I've lost count of the number of meetings I've been in Westminster or around Westminster with politicians, ministers, junior ministers, who are all saying increasingly, and I know they're being polite sometimes, but they are still saying it, the churches are making a big impact. They might be saying it out of desperation. They might be saying it with their teeth gritted, but you can't quite see how deeply gritted they are. They might be saying it to please the audience. But I've looked closely behind the eyes, and some of them actually realize it's true. And it is true. So be encouraged. We're very glad to be here, very glad to partner with you today, and keen that you visit our stall, which my colleague Pete Linden is running outside on the right, and take our literature there, and have a look at our research, which Andy Biggs is heading up, and do fill in the networking cards as well. So, Andrew, that's my opening comments. I hope they're helpful to get the ball rolling for today's conference. Thank you so much for listening.